So, the Victorian Age. So this is week 3 of our online Brit Lit II course this summer, and we are moving on to the Victorian Age. Now, the Victorians were a rather odd bunch, named for Queen Victoria, the queen who ruled for the bulk of the 19th century. She ascended the throne in 1837, and she left the throne when she died. You don't really get a choice at that point, in 1901. So Victoria's reign really is sort of the political embodiment of the 19th century. The Victorians were complicated, often more complicated, I think, than they appear on the surface, because we have all these stereotypes of the Victorians, largely given to us by the Edwardians and the Georgians in the early 1900s, that the Victorians were very priggish, that they were prudes. This is where we get sort of the idea that, or this is the era we associate with, like, when women showing their ankles was sexy and all this. And that's true. The Victorians did have these sort of strongly ingrained senses of modesty and propriety and manners and custom and things like this. But they also had some sort of bizarre tendencies. Things like this excessive sort of national pride, this sort of feeling of middle-class superiority in a lot of ways. And then these working-class cultures as these sort of undercurrents of Victorian mainstream culture, working-class cultures of tremendous joy in things like music hall performances, Punch and Judy shows. Punch and Judy, a lot of Americans are not sort of familiar with this, but they were sort of puppets that hit each other with sticks and things. You should look it up on YouTube. I'm sure there's some fantastic clips. So there were all of these sort of popular forms of entertainment, but then you also had this sort of tremendously terrible undercurrent of urban poverty. Like, during the high points of the Victorian era, something like 1/3 of London's population was living on bread and tea. Like, that was their entire diet. Like, there was just tremendous poverty, tremendous suffering. But at the same time, you have this sort of glories of the Victorian Empire. So this is an empire that spreads around the world. We get the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire during this period, because the British have full control of India, they have Australia and New Zealand, they have Canada, they have Caribbean colonies like Jamaica, they have Ireland, they have various places in Africa, Egypt, South Africa, West African countries like Ghana and Nigeria, or modern countries like Ghana and Nigeria. They didn't exist at the time. So the British are this massive force, which is a great source of national pride for them, but it's also it also represents a kind of threat to British culture as returning colonial administrators and soldiers and things like this come back from places like India and come back from places like South Africa with new ideas about the world, new ways of seeing things, new culture, new literature, and things like this. This is when the British start to produce curry, which is an Indian dish, or is based, rather, on an Indian dish. And the British are actually kind of terrible at it in the Victorian Age. It's not until much later that when you start to get large groups of Indian immigrants, Pakistani immigrants, and so on and so on, coming into Britain, that you start to get really good curry over there. But today, one of the most beloved national dishes of Britain. In the Victorian period, people start cooking and serving curry, even if it's not very good. So, this is a period of major shifts. So, we've got, on the one hand, this sort of strain of middle-class Puritan kind of values, everything about propriety and all of this. On the other hand, we've got this sort of rapid expansion of the way that the British see the world and see themselves in it, both in terms of nationalism and in terms of what we would now, thanks to post-colonial theory, call cultural hybridity. So both India, Africa, Australia, and so on, become what we would call hybrid cultures, as does Britain. And that hybridity involves sort of taking bits and pieces from both cultures in the colonial encounter and sort of establishing a new culture based on that blend. So India has sort of a national, under the British Raj, which is what British-dominated India was called. Raj coming from the Indian word for king. So under the British Raj, India gets a sort of national university system, which is based on the British education system, and that is still the basis for Indian higher education today. The British get things like curry and tea and things like this, which sort of revitalizes British cuisine in new ways. So these would be examples of how we get these sort of hybrid cultures. But I mean, the point that I'm trying to make with this sort of spiel is that the British during the Victorian age are a complicated group because the world is expanding around them. And so the British are attempting to figure out ways of dealing with that expansion, dealing with that rapid expansion, in the same way that they had attempted to deal with similar rapid expansions during the Renaissance and the Restoration and things like this. And so British culture goes from being very, very insular, very much sort of contained within England itself in the Romantic era, and by the end of the Victorian era, Britain is a global power, really the first properly global power, maybe since Rome. And even the Romans didn't sort of have the full sort of global expansion that the British had. I mean, the British had colonies on every continent except Antarctica, and the Romans couldn't have made the same claim. So, I mean, the British are in a unique position at this point, and part of the reason that they're in such a unique position is because they have experienced rapid industrialization and rapid technological developments. And these are the things that lay the groundwork for Britain becoming the first world superpower, the first properly world superpower. So during this era, so during the Romantic era, mid to late 18th century, you had the development of the steam engine by James Watt, who was a Scottish inventor. But then, during the Victorian era, you really have industrialization taking off in a major way. So what that means, there's a couple of important results here. One is that the British worldview comes to be very focused on the idea of progress. This idea that we can always discover a solution, we can always find an answer, we can always build or invent or discover or explore an answer to any problem. And so the British become very sort of pragmatic about solving problems. And maybe the great sort of symbol of this is the railway network. Britain builds massive amounts of railways. And again, we can harken back to the Romans, the way the Romans built roads all over everything. Everywhere the Romans went, they needed a road. And because this was a sort of great military, strategic, and commercial value to them, they could transport soldiers, they could transport goods, they could build infrastructure, whatever it was they needed, on the basis of roads. The British did the same thing with rail lines. So you built rail lines between everywhere in London. You build rail lines between London and Cardiff, London and Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Newcastle, Norwich, anywhere that you can put a railroad to, they built a railroad to. And actually the British still have this railroad infrastructure today, and it's a great way to get around Britain. I mean, when I was there the first time, I went from London up to Edinburgh in about 5 hours. So I mean, I actually made a day trip of going to the city of York, which is in northern England. Day trip, thanks to British Rail, going from London to York, spent several hours in York, and then took a train home and got back to London in the evening. So, I mean, this was a massive sort of undertaking for the British. And they did this not only in Britain, but they did this in the colonies as well. So you'd build railroads from Delhi to Calcutta. You'd connect, you'd connect Cape Town with Johannesburg, whatever it was. They built all these railroads, and this is one thing that allowed them to move goods very quickly and to move troops very quickly to maintain control of the empire. So, but I mean, you also had sort of massive expansions in factory work and things like this, especially in northern England. Towns like Manchester. Manchester went from a tiny, basically a village, to a massive population very, very quickly because they built steel mills, they built cotton mills, they built wool mills, textile mills, and all of this stuff. And there was this sort of rapid expansion of the urban population in Britain. And so, I mean, this happened in a number of different places. Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, Belfast, but nowhere more than London. So London itself went from being a fairly small town or a fairly small city in the Renaissance era. I mean, the city of London itself is 1 square mile, but due to this massive influx of people, I mean, the population something like tripled over the course of the Victorian era. Due to this massive influx of people, London just expanded. Like, it went all out. And now London is actually a massive city, or the greater London area is actually a massive city that's just swallowed up a bunch of towns that used to be independent towns. Places like Greenwich and Islington, Chelsea, and Tottenham, and places like this that used to be their own towns are now part of the greater London metropolitan area. And of course, the vast majority of these people who came to London or came to Manchester or Glasgow or wherever it was lived in poverty. I mean, they were workers. They were working in factories and things like this. But because Britain was really the first country that launched industrialization on a massive scale, they found out fairly quickly that there was a ton of social problems that came with that, chief among these being the results of poverty and the results of poor working conditions. And so you had issues like, very much like early coal miners in West Virginia faced. Unsafe working conditions. People who worked in textile mills, for instance, their lungs would become sort of filled with wool fibers or cotton fibers or whatever it was, because there was just fibers floating through the air all the time, and so people would have these hellacious lung diseases because their lungs were full of these fibers. Machines had no sort of safety precautions, so a lot of workers ended up crippled. You would get an arm caught in a machine or a leg caught in a machine or something like this. There was no there were no sort of limitations on working hours, so you would often work 14, 16, 18-hour shifts. There were no sort of wage requirements, so people would work for very little money, and women and children who worked for less money. They loved employing children because children have very small hands, so you can stick them into machines and fix things and whatnot. And also they're children, so you can pay them a fraction of what you would pay an adult man. So there was all of this stuff, and one of the sort of offshoots of this is actually that you get the labor movement. You get socialism, you get trade unions, you get the idea of a workers' strike and things like this. But of course the labor movement at this time had no real protections. So if employers wanted to fire everybody and hire whoever else, poor people, unemployed people, a lot of times they would actually, factory owners would actually bring in Irish workers and then basically lock them in factories and say, we've given you jobs, now you just work. So there was this weird sort of slave dynamic. And so Britain is also trying to figure out all of these components. So at this point I'm going to give you guys my 3 big trends for the Victorian age, which are actually coming out of the things I was just talking about. So the first one is the massive industrial expansion that we get during this time, which creates a massive amount of national wealth. It creates a large capitalist class, people who are very wealthy, who are using their money to reinvest in factories and new technology and things like this. And then we have the rapid population expansion as there are factory work opportunities in cities. So again, London, Manchester, Glasgow, Liverpool, Belfast, etc., etc. Their populations just explode. The workers in these cities are extremely poor, miserably poor in many cases. Things like prostitution also expand rapidly because women who either are unmarried or whose husbands have died or have been injured or whatever it is, often, so I mean the prostitute class in cities like London was just massive to try and bring in extra money. But on the plus sides of this rapid industrialization, we get things like a technology boom that improves railroads, improves shipping, improves communication, distribution of goods, along with industrial production. The second big trend of the Victorian age is Victorian social consciousness. So the Romantics had been more or less interested in themselves and interested in individual experience, emotional understandings of the world, and things like this. It would have been a very sort of internal culture, a very emotionally oriented culture. The Victorians tend to be much more pragmatic, and they tend to be much more externally focused. So this is a great era of social causes. We get the temperance movement. The anti-slavery movement is largely over by this time because it basically succeeds, and Britain outlaws slavery in Great Britain and the colonies in 1833. But we have the temperance movement, which opposes alcohol. We have a women's rights movement, which is about educating women, providing legal opportunities for them to inherit property, to own businesses, and things like this. We have the child labor movement, which launches a series of investigations of child labor in different industries and ultimately leads to child labor laws. We get some workers' rights, although this doesn't really start to happen until slightly after the Victorian period. But we get all of these social causes. So people are very interested in finding real, pragmatic, working solutions to the problems that they face as a society. And then the third big trend that's going to shape the literature that we're reading is the British Empire itself. Now, again, I've already talked through some of this, but the British Empire becomes massive. It becomes basically the largest empire the world has ever seen, with, at its height, a quarter of the world's population, 1 in 4 people, being a subject of Queen Victoria. So massive empire, massive. And so, I mean, we get a couple of different major results from this. One is British nationalism, sort of the British sense of themselves at the apex of history, that they are the great victors of history. The other is sort of increasing cultural hybridity as people come back, again, from India and Africa, Jamaica, the Caribbean, whatever it is, and they introduce these new ideas and new ways of thinking about things. So those are the 3 big trends that I want you guys to look for as we're reading for the next 2 weeks, as we're reading the Victorians. So again, massive expansion of technology and all of the results that come with that. Victorian social consciousness and desire to find pragmatic solutions to problems, and the empire. Good.